Hey, what's up? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of SimplyPodLogical, a Simply Nailogical podcast.
Hello.
All right, before we get started, we have to issue a couple corrections about our last episode,
Oops.
Cristine. So there were two of them. We said a phlebotomist is someone who removes your veins.
I said that.
Cristine said that. Sorry,
Cristine
I wasn't
is
trying to throw
sorry.
you under the...
I'm sorry.
That is not the case. A phlebotomist is someone who is just...
Draws blood.
Yeah, who can take a blood sample.
Don't know how I got that mixed up.
I mean, you tried to Google it while we were talking, and I guess you saw veins. And the second one is I read a scenario. We read a bunch of posts from the Reddit Am I an Asshole subreddit, and there were a lot of examples of really terrible men in relationships. And one of the scenarios I read, I missed the part where it said that the person was actually a female and she was actually being really rude to her girlfriend in one of the cases. Mm-hmm. So it's very heteronormative of me, I guess, just assuming it was a male-female relationship, and I just missed the little F saying that
I
she
did it
was a
too.
woman.
I started referring to the poster as he, and that was totally our fault, and we're so dumb because it literally said F, like the poster
I
identity.
know.
We just
assume men are
we
terrible.
assumed, and I didn't pay close enough attention, so I apologize for that.
But there you go. If you were only listening, you wouldn't know that. But so evidence that women and men can be terrible in relationships.
Yes, thank you. It's not just men. Got it.
So what are we talking? Oh, so because, I hope people can forgive us for making those, spreading misinformation and making those mistakes. And I hope we aren't banned off social media as a result of spreading that misinformation.
We might be deplatformed from this podcast.
I hope not. So I guess that's what we want to actually talk about today, in sort of the context of recent events, people being banned on Twitter, conversations about free speech online and political bias in big tech. We thought we could have a conversation about that as well. I think we kind of have a maybe interesting perspective in that we are just old enough that we remember a time before social media. Things seem so much simpler then. But we're also, obviously heavily invested in social media and internet culture today. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine life without the internet now. And just to be transparent, we make a lot of money off of internet and social media business. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we're coming at this from.
And we also have political biases, as do a lot of people. We've already had a couple podcasts on politics, basically. We did ones where it was Canadians react to the American election. Mm-hmm. So that podcast exists out there. But
the elephant in this room is the political aspect of it, and I'm sure we'll get into it a bit. And obviously Trump being banned from Twitter, at least temporarily. We'll see if he gets his account back, is kind of prompting this conversation as well. Mm-hmm. Not just here, but in our culture and broader media and society. So
as of the date of recording this podcast, Trump is currently banned on Twitter.
Yeah, and a number of other social platforms.
Including Pinterest, apparently, where he previously did not have an account.
Are people on Pinterest now?
I don't know. I just thought that was funny.
I feel like people know our political leanings, and the purpose of this conversation isn't just to talk about our politics, but, if anyone watched we did a podcast right after the American election, not long ago at all. And I felt like we, or maybe me specifically, I really went out of my way not to just label everyone who voted for Trump as like a terrible person. Like I really sort of wanted to be charitable and fair and measured, because I guess where I'm coming from is if we think that social media has contributed to the polarization and heightened tension and everyone hating each other, I guess I don't want to be another piece of contributing to that. Okay, so Let's not get too political, but we kind of posed a series of 8 questions on Twitter that are just sort of simple yes or no questions, and we thought we could use that to sort of guide us through a conversation about social media and your rights to have social media.
Mm-hmm. So we'll hear what you guys have to think, and then we'll discuss.
So the first two kind of are pretty closely aligned. So the first one is, should tech companies be allowed to limit, remove, or ban individual companies from their services? Overwhelmingly, 86% of people said yes, 5% of people said no, and 9% of people are not sure. We got between 6,000 and 9,000 responses to each of these. And I'll just read the second just because it had like almost the exact same responses is having a social media account a privilege or a right? 87% of people agreed with it being more of a privilege. Only 6% of people said a right, and 7% of people said they weren't sure. So clearly there is, at least in our audience, but I think we see this in like the broader public opinion we sort of see in our circles anyway, that there is a recognition that tech companies should have an allowance to regulate the people and content on their platforms. We posed it as people, but really we're just talking about content. When you look at the sort of policies these platforms have about what is or isn't allowed, they're not categorizing people. They're saying like, if you are harassing people, we will kick you off, you know?
Yeah, and I think just to give some what I believe most people were thinking when they said yes, and that it having an account is a privilege, is because social media companies are by definition private companies that have terms of service that can basically do whatever they want so long as you agree to the terms of service and those are established. So a private company has every right to kick you off for whatever reason if you violated their terms of service.
Yeah, so actually, so that is the main component of this answer, and I think you're right, what most people are thinking. But the question isn't, can they? As private companies, they absolutely can. There's no question, right?
Should they?
But it's given the importance of these platforms to the public discourse, should they be able to? And I think there's a more nuanced conversation we could have around that, in the sense that I hear what you're saying, and I agree. They are private companies. I think not only should they, but I think they kind of have an obligation to not have certain content on their platforms, maybe. But at the same time, if we think of the internet more broadly and how important it is to just how people, live and communicate with other people, if we were just talking about the internet, I'm a little bit more inclined to want to think of it almost as a public utility and think it maybe should be seen as such in a legal framework maybe. And I wouldn't be surprised if we increasingly have laws and things that treat internet access as a public utility. But that doesn't mean these private services like Twitter or Instagram necessarily would have to be treated like that.
I was just
right?
going to say the same thing because I saw an argument in the comments basically arguing for access to social media as a right rather than a privilege, being that social media is the new public gathering space or the new town hall, let's say. It's just the 2020 version of it. So it should be, according to this argument, your right to have a presence there. And so I would counter that with what you just said, which is internet access, I think, should be widely made available as much as possible by the government. At least that's how it's kind of moderated in Canada. They're working more and more to bring internet access to the north, for example, where it has historically just not been available. I think that should be seen as a right for like basic essential human needs in this day and age. But having access or a social media account handle on a particular platform that may come and go, like who knows if Twitter will be dead in 5 years? I don't know. Like look what happened to Vine. Like who knows, right? I don't think that is a right. That is a privilege of the current time.
Yeah, I think if you're going to have a conversation about rights, you have to also consider the rights of private companies to regulate themselves, right? The same people complaining about the political bias of Twitter are maybe the same people who said a baker shouldn't have to bake a cake for a gay couple, right? So like you're advocating for the rights of businesses to serve who they want. This is just Twitter or other social platforms choosing who they are willing to serve their service to, right?
Yeah, good point.
It's not that different. I just have, maybe this is coming from a place of privilege and it's a more of a semantic argument, but when you talk about things as rights, I feel like it almost sort of diminishes that they aren't just these sort of external entitlements. So like your point about the internet, I agree with you. I think it's important as a society that we give people internet access, and initiatives like giving people in remote communities internet access, I think is a very positive thing. But to say it is a right, to me, almost sort of takes away from the fact that it's, someone is paying for it. It's not just like a God-given right. It is, we as a society agree that it's worth making the investment and giving everyone access to something. I guess you could just call that a right. But when I think of things like internet access and healthcare, like these are things I want people to have, and society makes investments in those things. I just don't know if using the language of rights is necessarily the most useful framework to look at those things.
Well, that's why, like, I don't really understand when some people in the States have said things like, access to my social media platform is a right, but then at the same time be okay with the fact that healthcare is a privilege and not a right. Like, why would you put one of those things above the others? I don't understand how people are okay with that. Like, to me, there's so much dissonance there that, like, that doesn't compute.
I mean, like, obviously the political bias aspect of this is huge, and we're not trying to dance around it. Maybe we should address it because, I watched, so Joe Rogan podcast had on Jack Dorsey, the
CEO
of Twitter.
Back in 2019.
This was a while back, but he had him on once, and then the reaction to the podcast was that Joe wasn't tough enough in asking him questions about political bias. So he brought him back on with a lawyer or the head of like the legal, one of the people who works in the legal division of Twitter. And Rogan also brought on a conservative YouTube commentator, Tim Pool. I have my opinions about that guy, but it was a really fascinating conversation. And I thought the Twitter executives did a really good job of kind of explaining where they were coming from. I think it's worth watching, no matter which side of that ideological spectrum you are on. But I guess like the argument that kept getting repeated from the conservative side of things, and what you'll hear is that big tech has a bias against conservative voices. Mm-hmm. And one of the examples that kept coming up, or that they explored for a long time, was dead naming or harassing trans people on Twitter. So Twitter's view is we just have general anti-harassment policies, and we have decided, due to our understanding of like external sources and through our observations of how people are harassed on Twitter, that if you intentionally call someone who identifies as a gender by the gender they had at birth, or if you intentionally misgender someone repeatedly, in a targeted way, we consider that harassment. And the conservative commentator in this case was trying to argue that that was ideologically biased against conservatives.
Because it's not their truth. They don't see that as...
Exactly, because
right.
It's a progressive worldview, is the argument, that even accepts the existence of trans people. So he is trying to say that there's an ideology behind how they enforce what is harassment on their platform. In that way, any enforcement of anything called harassment is somewhat subjective, right? And I guess you could argue that there's an ideological basis for any of this, the same way you could say any category or thing in life is a social construct to some degree if you look at it sociologically.
Like, what is violence?
But if your best argument that Twitter is biased against conservatives is that conservatives are more likely to harass and misgender trans people, I think that's a really terrible argument.
Yeah, but
right?
they don't see it as harassing. They see it as speaking the truth.
But here's an important distinction. On Twitter right now, you could say things denying the existence of trans people. You can say that, like, I don't want to say these things just to be triggering, but you can express an opinion that rejects that worldview, right?
Yeah.
What you can't do is target someone who belongs to that group repeatedly for the purposes of harassing them. And it's up to Twitter. They have the tough job of trying to assess whether or not that is happening. And I guess what some conservatives would say is that does Twitter apply the same sort of lens when conservatives are being harassed on Twitter, or just general harassment? People are harassing each other on Twitter all day.
Yeah.
And so you could argue that Twitter has sort of prioritized certain classes of people being harassed over others. And you could make the argument that maybe there's some ideological or political bias in how they treat those things. I don't think Twitter would concede that point. They say it's according to like the severity of the threat, right?
And also the likelihood of causing harm.
Exactly, right? If someone is literally threatening to hurt someone, they should be prioritizing that over like more petty harassment. I think it's important to be able to have controversial discussions, whether you're in a university class or on Twitter. Like, Like, you know, it's a hugely controversial thing is whether or not people who were born biologically as men, or should trans women be able to compete with people who were born as women in sports. I think you can have a conversation about that without harassing trans people or without denying the humanity of trans people. But I think it's really important that we can have those conversations and you can express an opinion about it respectfully without just being labeled as hateful or a bigot, right? So there is the nuance here, but I feel like there's such a wide gap between what is being accused on these platforms of the bias and what we are actually seeing. What we're actually seeing is trans people being harassed and Twitter kicking those people off. What we're not seeing is Twitter suppressing people having honest conversations about gender. I don't think that is the case.
Yeah. You're very passionate today, Ben.
Maybe I'm just in a terrible mood today. I'm sorry if I'm taking it out on you.
You're making great points. I think people listening to this will find a lot of value to hear you put that all so well. At least I think maybe I'm biased. Maybe I'm just biased that I think everything you say makes sense. But right.
But who would want Twitter's job? Like when Jack Dorsey created Twitter, yeah, or any of these social media
YouTube
platforms.
does the same thing.
Yeah, people act like the people who are like most certain of like these platforms not being responsible in how they regulate themselves. I just want to ask them, like, do you think it would be like, do you have like the solution for how to perfectly regulate these platforms?
Yeah, I want to give those people about 2,000 cases of like submissions of complaints about harassment and whatnot and have them decide on each of them, spend a full day doing that. Or now what do you think?
To be a fly on the wall in Susan Wojcicki's office while she's talking to like 100 lawyers telling her what she should or shouldn't or can't do, and she has an obligation to shareholders to make money. Like, I don't know, if I was king of YouTube for a day, there's probably some accounts I would delete because I think they are harmful to the platform. But I think it takes an enormous amount of
don't tell us.
Yeah, should I list them?
No, go on. Enormous amount of restraint.
Enormous amount of restraint, not to just make some more sweeping decisions. And I think the fact that they have a tendency to keep the platforms open, and only very reluctantly have we seen these bans lately, right?
So that's interesting because in 2019, when the CEO of Twitter did an interview with Joe Rogan, I guess it was the first one maybe that I saw, they were discussing the potential banning of Trump at that time, like almost 2 years ago. And I remember him, Jack, saying like, it didn't make sense at the time, mostly because he went over the terms of service and yada, yada. And it wasn't as clear. Although I think maybe in the back of his mind, you could presume it was something he might do if it made sense. But I think he was arguing like he couldn't and wouldn't at that time. And now, I guess they have decided that Trump's tweets and actions have met the threshold for banning him.
So I think what's interesting, I followed this pretty closely, so I can give a little more context. Yeah. I don't think that's wrong, but I guess what I would add is, I think Twitter for a long time has acknowledged that Trump has broken their terms of service on numerous occasions. He's tweeted he's glorified violence in tweets. He threatened to blow up cultural landmarks in the Middle East, which is a war crime, by the way. So I don't think Twitter loves that. But the point is, he has. I shouldn't be laughing about that. I'm laughing at how absurd it is. Yeah. He has violated the controversy isn't why was he banned, it's why wasn't he already banned, because he has broken their terms of service.
Right.
So what he's really asking for is special treatment. So the fact that they have finally banned him because he violated it numerous times and now in a way which they thought could cause imminent violence was kind of their last straw. But in my mind, the controversy, I understand there's like a lot of gray area and ethical debate about how much power Twitter has and whether you don't want the president of the United States to have that sort of public platform. And their argument was it was in the public interest to keep him on the platform for that reason. But when he has repeatedly violated their terms of service, and at a certain point, there were plenty of people who wanted him off Twitter a long time ago and thought his presence there was literally harmful, not just symbolically harmful. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, maybe we can go on to the next question. We're probably already starting to cover what the next topics are, but
No, okay. Privilege or right. Okay, third one. Is the censorship of someone's social media activity account an infringement on their right to free speech? So I guess we've sort of already covered this train to some degree, but
the answer you guys responded.
okay. Okay, so yeah, so only 10% of people said yes to this.
Yeah, and 3 and 4 of you said that
No,
it's
yeah.
not an infringement on your right to free speech.
14% of people are not so sure. I think the main thing about the free speech argument here is, again, we are talking about private companies, right? Maybe if we were just talking more broadly about the internet, there's a discussion to have around whether the internet should be a public utility, net neutrality, all these things. But as far as private companies are concerned, the First Amendment, yeah, you looked into this too,
I looked
right?
this up because I constantly hear, my right to free speech, First Amendment, yada yada. But like, I'm Canadian, but still forced to almost automatically understand what like the First Amendment is because it's just so prominent in social media discourse in which I participate, even though it doesn't affect me because I'm not a citizen of the United States. But out of curiosity, I looked it up, which I'm sure I have in like history class way back when, when we learned about American history. But just to refresh my memory, and maybe for those of you who aren't American, the First Amendment covers freedom of religion, right to assemble, freedom of speech is one of them, and freedom of the press, and a couple other things. And the definition is free and public expression of opinions without censorship, interference, and restraint by the government.
Yeah.
So it's specifically like Congress shall make no law, yada, 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 abridging freedom of speech. So it's about the government not taking steps to violate American citizens' ability to,
Exactly.
Make their voices heard.
So it's so frustrating when you're having these conversations and someone who is like a free speech advocate or like First Amendment proponent doesn't understand that point, right?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about private companies. It would be like, and we've seen this recently, like one of the politicians who incited the attack on the Capitol had a book deal, and that book deal was taken away. And he went on conservative media, and they're saying what an affront to the free speech this is, or the First Amendment. I don't have a right to have Simon & Schuster publish my thoughts.
Yeah, you'll have to find another publisher.
A book publisher can choose who they want to publish or not.
Yeah.
And they could use whatever factors they want to consider to decide that. At the same time, I don't want to be super dismissive of this. That's a very important distinction anytime you're having this conversation. But when people are advocates of free speech, they're not literally only talking about First Amendment protections against government interfering with your right of free expression, right?
One thing I just wanted to add about the free speech stuff, and I know like Phil has said this many times, and so have many other people, is there's a difference between freedom of speech and then freedom from consequences. Because if we can argue, like, you can say whatever you want and on whatever social media platform you want, is if that's your wish or argument, that doesn't mean that you can escape the consequences of people judging you, not liking you, hating you for whatever you say. So you have to accept that if you're going to argue for you want to be able to say whatever you're going to say.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly put. It's not... Your freedom to express yourself isn't freedom from the consequences of expressing
You're
those
free
things.
to be a jackass, but people are free to call you a jackass. Too bad.
Absolutely. And then I guess maybe that I didn't articulate this very well, but like even if the First Amendment or free speech laws about the government regulation of speech don't apply to these platforms, I still think it's fine to advocate for these services still adhering to this value of being free and open platforms and free speech still being important, even if they don't have an obligation or the First Amendment doesn't even apply in this case, right?
Yeah, you're right. I think there should be some general principle that you can express your beliefs so long as they don't harm others. Now, like you said earlier, that can get a bit subjective because some people disagree with the viewpoints of others that harm others, but you kind of just need to like you have to look at this at a high overall level. Are we harming a group of people? Sometimes there is a clear answer, yes or no. Even if you don't think it's offensive to someone else, that doesn't mean it isn't.
Sure, but I think there is legitimate concern that it is private companies that are sort of getting to decide it, especially when we're talking about platforms that have become sort of the main platform through which people have public conversations. So there is an interesting conversation to have here. I don't want to be just dismissive of people who have concern about free speech. I care about free speech. I'm very familiar with all the sort of academic arguments people have and the sort of cliches people say. But like, here's maybe an interesting example. Like, you'll often hear people say free speech is sunlight is the best disinfectant. Have you ever heard this? The idea that if people have
Sunlight? I thought it was bleach.
I think the expression is sunlight because it's
Okay.
exposure is the best disinfectant.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like, if people have awful views, you don't want to just like hide them away and let them have those crazy thoughts in their little sleeper cells and spread it in their communities. To be able to have open conversation about those views so that people can react to them and try to educate people on why they are wrong is an important function of having these open places of dialogue, right? So
I would agree with you that sounds like that makes sense. But unfortunately, when you try to educate some of these people, they will not accept it. And you're just going to end up wasting your breath. I think that would be a counter argument to what you're saying. It's good in spirit that we can like think, let's educate people, and then we'll all agree. But I don't know if that always works in practice.
So I don't think it always works. And I think social media has been a really good example of that not working, actually, which is unfortunate because I want to believe in that in principle. And I think in some contexts, that is a very valuable thing. And it's important not to just push these people to the recesses of society where they just further radicalize, maybe. But if what we have seen on places like Facebook, where, you know, some mom can just spread information about vaccines that is completely false, the you know, that being exposed to people, unfortunately, isn't just exposing it to people who are going to say, based on the evidence, that is wrong. What is happening is a lot of other uninformed people are finding it and are choosing to believe in anonymous Facebook groups instead of believing doctors and scientists and people who actually know what they're talking about.
Or people who find their information from TikTok.
Right. And to what extent then do these social media platforms then have an obligation to regulate misinformation, which was sort of the next question. Do social media companies have an obligation to moderate their platforms and suppress misinformation and or harmful content? This one had the clearest, there was a clear consensus here. 94% of people say yes, 3% of people say no, and 3% of people are saying not sure. So overwhelmingly, people recognize that these companies have an obligation to do this. What's sort of interesting, and I guess this didn't really come up when we were talking about the politics of it, is that in the law, you may have heard of some Republican politicians, and Trump specifically, wanting to repeal Section 230 of the
I have heard that.
Internet something Indecency Act. Okay, so let me give some context here, because even though these people are agreeing they have an obligation to moderate, and most of these social media companies think they do and agree they have an obligation to do that, under the law, this bill was mostly about child pornography, I believe, actually. But this specific section was just saying that providers of the internet or internet businesses, platforms, aren't treated like publishers under the law. So if you do a Google search and the top result is something defamatory or illegal in some way, it is saying that YouTube is not treated as the publisher of that content and isn't legally responsible for it.
Who is the actual poster or account?
The actual poster. And there's some, you know, like there are some illegal things on the internet that publishers or any internet service providers do have an obligation to take down. There's like specific cases here. But the main point is, if someone is posting on a message board somewhere on the internet and it shows up in a Google search, Google is not responsible for that person having written that thing on a message board that just shows up through a Google platform, for example. What Trump recently tried to do was he got some spending bill for the military, and he didn't want to sign it into law unless they added them repealing that section, because he wants these. I think he just wanted to punish these social media companies because it would put the obligation on them as a publisher of that content to be legally liable for what people are saying on their platforms.
So all of a sudden, all the bad things that can come up in a Google search would be Google's responsibility?
Yeah, and what you would see is these companies have to take drastic steps in terms of filtering what content
shows up in their search
You know what would
engine.
happen? Twitter would have a much easier decision on their hands when it comes to banning people like Donald Trump on the platform. You know what I mean? It would really force them to do things like that. If someone is inciting violence,
you basically have to clean up house. Yeah, it would really force them to.
Yeah, and that's not a future of the internet I think we want.
Why did he want that?
I think he mostly wanted to punish them. I think
he wanted to punish quote unquote left wing.
Well, Twitter specifically, because they kept labeling his tweets as misinformation, which has kind of been Twitter's response to, if we think there's a public value in keeping these people on the platform,
it's like
we should at least label and put disclaimers on them when they are disputed. They say they're disputed, but we know what they're saying. They're saying this claim is just nonsense, right?
It's like a trust indicator. But as determined by Twitter.
And it's interesting to see if trust indicators sort of pick up steam on the internet.
Well, they really came about with the COVID stuff is when I started noticing it. Like even on Instagram, you'd see like someone would mention COVID in the caption, and maybe it was just innocuous and like they weren't really saying anything. They were just like COVID lockdown, and there's a picture of their dog. And then there would still be like a banner that popped up that says like for more information from your local government on COVID. This is what I saw in Canada, actually. I'm not sure if the same was the case in the States.
Yeah, no, and we talked to someone at YouTube at one point about it. Because like
on our YouTube videos, I'd see it too.
Exactly, right? You've done a couple YouTube videos where I guess if even like COVID was like mentioned
or the
in
word
the
quarantine.
Video,
Like I was at home quarantining with my cats, and then I'd see like a banner that said for more information about COVID, here's a link to your local government.
Your like local public health authority on it. Yeah, I don't have an issue with that. That seems like a pretty reasonable case. So we're on to the fifth question we asked people. Do you think social media bans work in terms of suppressing information and harmful content? And here's where we see a sort of shift in the question. So this is really an empirical question, but we're asking people what their impression is of the efficacy of
and also the
people.
Interpretation of does it work can mean something a bit different to different people, I think. I know we specified of suppressing misinformation, but again, that can be a little bit subjective if you think something is true that maybe isn't. Yeah,
so 45% of people think social media bans do work in some respect in terms of suppressing misinformation and harmful content. 28% of people say no, and 27% of people say they aren't sure.
So that's a pretty significant, large portion of people saying they're not sure. And I think that's it's okay, because it's probably the one question that I'm like, I also am not 100% positive either, mostly because I haven't run my own research studies on whether or not bans work.
Yeah, and this really is an empirical question, right? So people can say what their hunch or experience is, but if you want to read the next question, we asked people, do you think social media bans make it harder to have open and honest conversations? 62% of people say no, 21% of people say yes, 17% of people say they're not sure. I think it's kind of obvious that they could make it harder to have open conversations if you buy into this sort of slippery slope idea. But in terms of what sort of bans we've seen to date, it's not like conservatives have been purged from Twitter. People are acting like that's the case. A few specific accounts that have openly called for violence and overthrowing the government have been banned, right?
Right.
So what are we really wringing our hands over right now? If there was actual evidence of Twitter silencing the voices of millions of conservatives, I am there with you in saying that is a big problem. That is not what we are seeing right now.
I agree with you. I think the other side would argue that, but by silencing a leader,
Okay, but
you
this
are
isn't
essentially
CNN
Islam.
Crossfire. We don't need to give
I
airtime to two sides when one side is not.
I appreciate that. I'm just anticipating some people listening might say but this. So I'm trying to think of that. That's all.
Okay.
Do you want to hear the reasons for why social media bans can work?
Well, is it based on evidence or is these just the arguments for
So
why?
there is research. I'll get
Okay.
to that, but let me just quickly say
Okay.
what the perceived efficacy is, or the effectiveness rather. So it gets rid of the imminent threat, reduces harm and potential for future harm. It shows a consequence for bad behavior, so it serves as a deterrent. And I think the most interesting thing is Vice and some researchers from an American university actually did empirical research on whether or not social media bans work. One of them was based on a 2015 Reddit ban on hate speech. There was a couple different channels. I think one of them was called "We Hate Fat People," something like that. And there was a few other along those lines there was just hate speech. So in 2015, a group of those were banned on Reddit. And then in recent years, a few pro-Trump media figures like.
Oh, could we not name these? I don't want to give any.
Okay. Should I
Please.
not name them?
I don't think you should name them. There's no point in
Okay.
naming. I don't want to even.
Okay, but in order to cite the research, I just want to make it clear
Sure.
what the research was based on. So the research was based on a couple of those right-leaning Trump-supporting figures that had been banned from numerous social media platforms for violating the rules and terms of service, right? There was uproar. So sorry, I'm being unclear. The conclusion of empirical research had found that despite the social media bans, what happened was at first there was an uprising in popularity for these people that were banned because people were initially like, what's going on? And so there was a lot of attention on them. So you could argue that that's not good and the opposite goal of the ban. But over time, they found that their popularity and public conversations around them, not just on their wherever forums they moved to, but on the internet in general, definitely declined. And they found that over the few years, depending on how long these people were banned, that it was effective, ultimately, the ban, and just like not silencing in one go, but just over time, almost like their discourse was just dying out. And now they've kind of
new people not becoming aware of that content.
I think
guess?
no, just overall number of I can't remember the exact metric they used, but it might have been like search results number appearing or chatter measures probably.
Okay.
So yeah, they have found that the banning of these right-wing voices after a period of time did ultimately work in their voices and popularity just like weaning away.
That's not accurate to say they were banned because they were like right-wing voices. Like the two people you mentioned, who I'm thinking maybe we'll just like bleep out their names because I think these people just thrive on getting any attention and I don't want to give them that. Same thing with a controversial like beauty guru who might just espouse a bunch of very far-right political views. They're doing that just because they know it gets them attention, and some people are so depraved they would rather be infamous than just have people not think about them. But the reason those aren't examples of right-wing figures being banned. They're examples of people inciting their followers to harass people whose children were murdered being harassed. Or they're examples of people who have histories of advocating for like white supremacy being banned. We're not talking about conservative commentators being purged from these platforms. We're talking about like the most odious elements of our society not being given a platform to spread awful things anymore. So we really have to, I think, draw a distinction between this isn't like mainstream conservative commentators losing their voice on Twitter. This is social media companies being like, holy shit, we can't give a voice to people who are this awful and dangerous.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
No, I agree, and I didn't mean to gloss over it. I was just trying to read it like factually.
Sorry,
article
I didn't
found.
mean to be dismissive. I appreciate your main point being there is at
it
least
worked
some
in the end, but of course, it is going to cause a spike in search results and popularity when the ban occurs.
Well, sure, yeah. When I've been on Reddit for years as just lurking around, and when people talked about subreddits being banned, the natural inclination is to think of, oh, what do they think I shouldn't be able to see? And it might not even be because you support or want to have anything to do with that, but there's just a curiosity element. And I have to say, a big part of me still thinks that the idea of the internet being this open and free, unregulated space is still a very important thing in some respects. And it's not like we're talking about people being banned from the internet, right?
No.
Like you not being able to have a Twitter account to incite violence or spread misinformation doesn't mean you don't have access to Google and the sort of benefits you can get in life from having access to the resources available to you online. And there are other places you can get together with crazy people. But no one owes you that platform when you like if you are doing things that are dangerous or terrible.
And I agree with everything you said. I think just to make it clear to our listeners.
No, you're doing a good. I'm sorry. I feel like I was a little rude to you there.
Okay, so here's something I think you guys know about my personality. I don't like taking sides because I hate conflict. And I'm more of a peacekeeper, and I just want to pretend there's no real issue and everyone get along. That's my hope for the world. I know that's not always true. But I do struggle sometimes that even though I know something, like I feel this way and I know that someone's behavior is terrible and I know that I feel this way, I struggle sometimes with just like putting it point blank out there. And I think the things you just said helps me in my own like insecurity with just saying what I think.
I think your tendency to not want to hurt anyone's feeling is a really good thing. I wish more people thought the way you think.
Then we wouldn't have anyone getting banned ever. It'd be great.
But, like, I guess maybe you do have a point, or maybe you recognize something in yourself that, like, sometimes things just need to be labeled as they are. And it's being nice shouldn't prevent you from being able to recognize or vocalize that, sometimes things are just obviously bad.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't be worried about hurting people's feelings when it comes to those things. I mean, you have, after years of being on the internet and having people questioning things you do and say, I think that leads to you or anyone in that position being more guarded about what they say on the internet.
Yeah.
Right?
I think you're right.
And I don't think it's a problem, too, that you're not like an overtly political person in your sort of public, in your content. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think celebrities or social media figures necessarily have an obligation to share their political opinions with you, right?
I think it puts a lot of pressure on them, and then what you get is a negative results, which can be like political performativity. And you get people just saying things and participating in things just so they appear to quash any questions from their audience. And like, that's not really what we want, is it? That being said, I also think that social media influencers, it's a good thing when they use their platforms for good. That doesn't mean I expect 100% of them to always be like, donate to this charity or I'm raising awareness for this. But I definitely find myself respecting people who do choose to use it for good, whatever that good is, right? Some people are more focused on, charities for children. Other people are more focused on politics and voting.
Yeah. All right. We went out like a long tangent there. Do we have
Is it still Tuesday, Ben?
I don't know anymore.
What else
there was only one more substantive question, which was like, are you comfortable with the level of power big tech and social media have in controlling public discourse? And I think this is maybe the most interesting finding because so far the majority of people pretty overwhelmingly have agreed that there is some obligation and an expectation that social media platforms do regulate specifically for misinformation and harmful content. But at the same time, 55% of people, more than half of people, aren't comfortable with the level of power big tech and social media have in controlling the public discourse. 24% aren't sure, and only 21% of people are generally comfortable with the situation as it currently exists. So even if you think it's important that these tech platforms have some sort of strategy to manage misinformation or harmful content, it seems like most people aren't really comfortable or don't really know how that should be done ethically and what the implications of that are.
It's because we all watch The Social Dilemma.
Yeah, it's proof that though people have a nuanced view of this. It isn't one people in one camp just saying, yeah, ban everybody, I don't care, and the other side being like free speech for everything. You know what I mean? Like the people who are concerned about how social media can be harmful have a more nuanced view of also wanting to consider the ethical considerations of what it means to have these tech companies have this level of influence.
I also think, and this was my fault, that the wording of this question is a little bit leading to make you think like, yeah, I think there is a level of power that they have in controlling public discourse. I tried really hard to make these questions not biased, right? To have them be like flat out questions. It's so hard. Like, if you can think of a better way to write this question and not be biased, like, let me know. But I just want to note that might have contributed to people's like immediate feeling of like wanting to reject that level of power, is saying that the word's controlling. Right?
I get what you're saying, but I think people, was it a little leading? Maybe. I don't know. I think that's a pretty fairly worded
But I think this
question.
is a good example of how a lot of us agree that we are concerned with the level of power, let's say, that social media companies have over us and our analytics and ability to serve ads and track things. And, we all have this concern of privacy and how that information can be used or misused, but also still want social media companies to do the things they do to regulate bad actors on the platforms. So I think this just proves that you can have an opinion that might appear on the surface to be in contradiction, but so long as you presumably are following the terms of service of those platform companies, and understand that there are some limitations maybe for your own comfort level on what you decide to upload to Facebook and what you decide to tweet within your own comfort, knowing that that information is now owned or, under some cloud somewhere on the internet, that I think you can feel both ways.
Yeah. I used to think, like thought experiment, that if you had a version of Twitter where people couldn't be anonymous, that would be a huge, that could solve a lot of the problem, is what I used to think.
Well, that's how Facebook started. You had to sign up with your student university account, so you couldn't be anonymous. I mean, it quickly changed that you could sign up with a fake name.
I'm not sure if there were ways around that or not. Maybe not in the beginning. But I guess the point was, I used to think that if people couldn't hide behind an egg avatar and you didn't have just a bunch of bots making conversations less productive,
There would be less like hate speech and
maybe
bullying.
People would just be, maybe there would be more humanity on Twitter.
I mean, I think you're right, because there's a lot of things people say on the internet that they would not say to someone in real life.
That's what I used to think. But increasingly, what I'm seeing is insane behavior from people who aren't hiding behind fake accounts.
You're just like, you're tweeting this, your picture is right there,
Honestly,
your full name.
Like, if you were to judge humanity by the way people talk to each other on Twitter without even hiding behind anonymity, it is really disheartening. And it's hard to come away with that and have a positive view of the way people interact with each other.
What a world in 2021 where we're judging people by the quality of their tweets.
It's also really it's too hard to tell fake accounts these days now too, right? Like you can there's some like AI, what was this article in the New York Times or something? They were saying sometimes like you can just like look up someone's photo and do a Google image search and clearly they just pulled someone from like a stock photo or something.
Right.
But I guess they have like AI and there's certain tools now where it
faces.
literally just makes a fake face for you that won't be tied to anywhere else though. It's very sophisticated. I wonder how often people are just arguing with bots on Twitter.
It's not even a real
How much
person.
of people's time is spent just arguing with robots.
Yeah. Good use of our time. And then the last question we had was just for respondent demographics, which we should have said at the outset. We're terrible researchers. We forget all of our skills in quarantine. And I totally asked this question the wrong way because I was rushing.
No, I think it's okay. So basically you wanted to get a sense like what are the sort of political leanings of the people answering these questions. So only 3% of people who responded to the survey in your audience identify as Republican.
Whether they live in the U.S. or not, just like how would you lean.
Sure.
Yeah.
64% say Democrat, 21% say other. And 12% say none or not sure. So we're talking a third of the people responding don't identify
As
with
either
of the major political parties or ideologies. And I think that's a really important point to end on, because
Start a new government. Let's go.
maybe we
New
need
party.
a third party. Yeah, a lot of people reject mainstream politics these days and don't feel like either party represents them. And I think that is totally fair.
Like, look at the state of the world, the state of America.
Who was excited? Like, we can say all the same terrible things about Donald Trump that a lot of people have, and that's, I think, generally how we feel. But who is getting out of bed in the morning very excited about Joe Biden? You're maybe excited that there might be a little bit of a more normal government for the next 4 years.
Yeah, that's what people were thinking. Like, 2021 is going to be a bit easier now.
Maybe.
Wow.
And I think if you are a progressive, you think Joe Biden is much better than another 4 years of Trump. But are you excited that you got Joe Biden as a president? The guy who's most of what he's talking about is, compromise with people who have been labeling anyone who leans to the left like enemies of America for the last 4 years. How do you compromise with people like that in good faith?
That's a whole other podcast, is can we compromise?
But I guess just the point is, yeah, it's a scary thing when you see so many people just totally not engaged or feeling like they are represented by the only two parties that can represent them in that country. I mean, sorry, there are other parties, but like, let's be honest, like, you're not being represented if you vote for anyone other than Republicans or Democrats.
Yeah, in Canada, we spoke about this a bit on our politics podcast, but there is a larger third party, and there is a somewhat, like, it's still a minority, but there's a fourth party. Actually, there's 7, I think, in total. But it's not the same way in the States, where there's like really only 1 or 2 choices. In Canada, there's a few more than 2. And I wonder if some of our followers here are also just Canadian, and so they're definitely picking the other category or the none.
Maybe, but yeah. I think it's good evidence that people just don't feel like represented by mainstream politics. And I think a lot of the people that support Trump, I don't want to just label all those people as bad or deplorable.
Some people would argue that you should.
I mean, to some extent,
I've definitely seen that conversation. Influencers have said, like, I don't care if you voted for Trump, you hate LGBTQ+, you hate other minority rights. Like, there's been a lot of people saying that you are a terrible person. So how would you respond to that?
Do you want to go here? I think if you are, a bigoted person, it's probably obvious who you would have voted for. Ask a white supremacist who they voted for in the last American election. I think you know what the answer will be, right? But that's not to say that all the people who voted Republican are those things. And I don't think it's productive to have a conversation about politics and assume that.
And I also think it's possible that people who did previously vote might have changed their minds after recent events. So it is kind of hard to just blanket hold that against everyone. When I like to believe that some of those people have changed their minds after recent events, and maybe if they could go back, they would.
So I saw some recent polling of Trump's approval rating as of this week, like the week before he is not in office anymore. And they said it's an all-time low for him, and it's about as low as George Bush polled towards the end of his presidency, which was very low, and it's around 30%. But to me, that still means 30% of people have seen everything that has happened the last few weeks and the last 4 years, and they're still willing to check that box saying they're okay with it. And that is just really hard to wrap. I find it very hard to wrap my head around that.
Brainwash?
Even if you're not supportive of the other mainstream party, I just don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Is that a bummer of a note to end on? You want to end with like a joke?
Yeah.
So I tried making Hawaiian pizza the other day in the oven. But I burnt it. And you know why?
Why, Ben?
Because I should have done it at aloha temperature.
Wow, everyone. Is Hawaiian pizza even a good pizza? How's that for a political question?
I'm pretty sure it's a Canadian invention. I think
Is it?
Hawaiian pizza started in Canada.
Yeah, I don't
I
like
don't
it
know
though.
why it's called Hawaiian.
I don't want.
People
I
know
want
what we're
my
talking about. We're talking about putting pineapple
pineapples
on pizza.
Yeah, not for me. I'll have my
I-
pineapples separately, please.
Disgusting. Yeah, I think you shouldn't put pineapple on pizza.
Well, this was fun. Another reminder, that getting political or talking about it is hard, and it's okay if you find it hard, like I do. Like I'm weird and find it hard to express things, even though I know in my heart maybe how I feel. I don't think everyone is as comfortable as others in talking about it.
You don't
and
have
it's
to
okay.
apologize for that. I think it's very honest of you to acknowledge that. And here's the thing: we're sitting here just having a sort of free-flowing conversation.
And it's a conversation between us.
This isn't a scripted essay, though, right? Like
Yeah.
we're going to listen to this back, and I'm probably going to disagree with things I just said.
Ben.
You understand
What?
how this works?
Yeah.
So,
you're
but
right.
I think having conversations like this is important.
It does help. I think so.
I would
Yeah.
like to think so. But apologies to Eva Gutowski. We were going to bring her in at the end to also get her thoughts, but we ran out of time. So sorry about that. But happy Taco
I hope
Tuesday.
Ben doesn't get banned from Twitter. Let's just.
What? I don't even tweet anymore. I don't get much out of
Why don't you tweet anymore?
I don't enjoy Twitter.
Why? I mean, that's fine. I'll just continue with my weird, things. It's
Well, I think
fine.
what you're doing, like you're tweeting about like oats and stuff, and that's cool. But like whenever I'll open Twitter and I'll scroll through and be like, oh, that's depressing, and then I'll turn my phone off, and it's like, okay, what did I get out of that?
Yeah, I don't find that. You just got to change who you follow. I follow a lot of like nails and beauty and fitness.
Oh yeah,
Fun.
okay.
Yeah, good times. All right, everybody. Well, happy Taco Tuesday. It's your weekly reminder that it is Tuesday. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. See
Thanks
y'all
so
later.
much for watching, and we'll see y'all later. Bye.